Today, the title of my lecture is Let the People Tell Their Own Story, the Traumatic Legacy of the White Exhibition of Black Death. On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was lynched by the Minneapolis Police Department. In response to this atrocity, millions of people marched and protested in all 7 continents, and thousands of people showed up in Minneapolis to participate in public grief and protest. People came and still come to the intersection of 38th Street and Chicago Avenue, known as George Floyd Square, to lay down what we call offerings in this sacred space of community, liberation, public grief, pilgrimage, and protest. Now, I live 3 short blocks away. As neighbors, many of us stepped up to care for this organic memorial to ensure that everything that is an offering would not be thrown away, and that the people who come to the memorial are cared for as more sacred than the memorial itself. This sub-movement of memorial caretakers within the larger movement for Black liberation birthed the George Floyd Global Memorial, which exists to conserve and preserve these stories of racial injustice. I am now the executive director of this important institution and continue to be lead caretaker of these important memorials and tributes to hundreds of names of people who have been lynched since Emmett Till. So if you were to come to 38th in Chicago, you will find the names go back as far as Emmett Till. Now, Emmett Till is one of the most controversial lynchings that has taken place within the last 100 years of our nation's story. It is also an important story for museums and exhibitors to hold as a reminder of this simple statement: who exhibits what matters. I started off my preparation for this talk by sifting through Getty images of lynched Black bodies before the Civil Rights Movement, before we actually come to Emmett Till. And I saw bodies hanging from trees and could hear the haunting tune of Billie Holiday singing Strange Fruit. 7 trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from poplar trees. I saw images of mobs of white people around the lynched body. I even saw one image where the body had been burned. I saw a lot of white men, but there were white women in the crowds at times. I saw older folks. I saw folks who looked like they could be teenagers. I saw folks with sickening grins as they posed for the picture. I saw Black Death on exhibits by white people. Now, Henry Louis Gates Jr. informs us in his book, Stony the Road, Reconstruction, White Supremacy, and the Rise of Jim Crow, that an estimated 400 Black people were lynched between 1868 and 1871 across the South by white vigilantes. That is a lot of people. It's spaced out, that is more than one person every 3 days being lynched. This kind of terror was extremely intentional to keep Black people from succeeding in society after the Emancipation Proclamation. Gates informs us that members of the Black political caucus were even targeted during this time, and at least 7 of them ended among the dead. So kind of shifting gears a bit, in her article, The Afterlife of Lynching, Bettina Carbone-Bonnell wrestles with the ethics of exhibiting the historical truth of lynching. She wrestles with both theory and praxis around human culture and offers this insight from her explorations. Quote, "The consequences of these acts of recomposition and their subsequent reception by the viewer or reader are of special concern when the subject matter itself continues to trouble the present and to call for responsible action, as it does with quote unquote history of lynching," end quote. But then she goes further to allow herself to be challenged by the 1980 work of Hayden White entitled The Value of Narrativity and the Representation of Reality. White pushes against the instinct to want to clean up stories for palatable storytelling, to create order or structure. So taking these insights, Carbone sets a goal. It seems to find a way to exhibit this trauma of lynching while simultaneously sharing the stories of those who fought to end lynching. I think her preference is to share the stories of those who fought to end lynching. But she's trying to create a balance of these two things in her exhibits. How do you get a visitor to interact with both the trauma and the good, and not just the good that emerged? That is the question she is digging at for herself, I sense. But I want to pose the question, is this her story to tell as a non-Black bodied individual? A few years before Carbonell began wrestling with how to tell the story of lynching violence in our country, a group of researchers in 2005 took up the topic of lynching to explore its legacy, namely in the correlation between lynching and homicides in America. Now, during their literary research phase, it was Stephen Messner, Robert Baller, and Matthew Zevenbergen. They came across a profound yet simple truth about lynching in America during the 19th and early 20th centuries. And that simply is this: lynching applies lethal violence for purposes of social control. This is important for all of us to understand. Now, remember the statistics of 400 lynchings in 3 years during the nation's Reconstruction period. Lynchings were used as control opposition to reject the idea that any Black person could ever be equal to any white person. Lynchings are not your standard homicide. They are acts of terror designed to take the law into one's own hands. They are performed with the end goal of social obedience. Lynchings are not about interpersonal conflict. Lynchings are not the same as a serial killer picking victims. Lynchings are designed to shape social behavior. It is a kind of terror that has formed and informed the Black experience in America. Now, what we witness with disproportional lethal police violence against Black bodies today are lynchings. If we pay attention to what happens after, we can hear the public, often the white public, comment with words like, he should have listened to the officer and obeyed commands. He should have not been a bad guy. She should have complied. He should not have been wearing a ski mask. He should not have been jaywalking. He was likely guilty of something. She should not have been holding a knife. He should not have run. Do these kinds of phrases sound familiar? It is the public comment that routinely emerges after the police kill a Black person in America. The comments often center on how the victims should have maintained the established social order. These comments, however, are not directed at the victim, really. They're directed at the living Black bodies who should act accordingly when they cross the path of the police, or their Black death will be justified too. But why should museums, exhibitors, and artists care about this context of lynching? Because Black lives really do matter. You see, the image of a lynched Black body or the created works around it or about it has a psychological effect on Black people in America. It is a kind of terror that has been passed down from generation to generation. It is a kind of terror that informs our way of life and raising families. It is a kind of terror that created what is commonly known as the talk in mainstream America to create awareness about the Black experience with racial oppression. If museums care about being in community with the Black community, then we must hold our collective experience with the greatest care. With that said, I have a personal confession to make. I often find myself sifting through the offerings that we have preserved at George Floyd Square and can feel in my body when a particular sign was made by a white person, and it makes me angry or annoyed, depending on the day. I can feel the difference when I am viewing a protest sign that says, "My life matters," from the sign that says, "I'm sorry, I will try to do better to understand." And that is the point. White-bodied people do not understand the trauma of lynching in the same way that Black-bodied people understand it, especially Black-bodied people who are descendants of slaves. One of the original exhibitions of Black deaths in this country took place in the poplar trees. These original exhibitions of lynched Black bodies in America by white people took place to terrorize Black families and communities. And thus, it's my common opinion that white body people should steer clear from the exhibition of Black death, lest one recreates unintentional harm. You see, because the harm is not in the story of Black death. The harm is in the actual act of exhibiting the narrative. Someone might ask, well, if we cannot tell the narrative, well, how will we learn from history? Well, that's a great question. The answer is simple. Listen to Black people. You see, in 1955, Emmett Till was sent down south to visit his Uncle Mose in Money, Mississippi. After an encounter with Miss Carolyn Bryant, a white woman, where he allegedly whistled at her, Emmett Till, at the age of 14, was brutally beaten, shot, and drowned by her husband, brother-in-law, and a gang of others who were likely involved. He was lynched. And by the way, Carolyn Bryant is actually still alive today. She has not been held accountable for her role in the death of Emmett Till. And Emmett Till still has no justice. But a lot of strings had to be pulled to get his body back to his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, in Chicago so she could bury him. When she laid eyes on her son, who was disfigured beyond recognition, she made a brave decision to hold an open casket viewing and funeral so that the world would see what white people in Money, Mississippi, what white supremacy in America did to her son. She partnered with the NAACP, Jet Magazine, and a host of Black activists to tell the story of a gruesome lynching as the Black mother. She put her son's body on display for the world to see, not only in 1955, but for generations to come. And what birthed was a generational movement of the likes we would not see for another 50 plus years when Trayvon Martin was lynched by Andrew Zimmerman. You see, the image of Emmett Till, yes, can trigger trauma. But the story of the lynched body of Emmett Till has a subversive impact because his mother chose to display the body and call people to action against lynching. The exhibiting of Emmett Till's body mobilized many people toward courage instead of terror after Mamie Till Mobley controlled the narrative of her own son and the people followed her lead. It is possible to appropriately learn from the trauma of Black lynchings when Black people are the storytellers. And when possible, the families of the victims of lynching violence must be centered with their stories held first. Now, I have not yet had the privilege of visiting the National Memorial of Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. Yet from every person I know who has visited that site, the feedback is profoundly powerful. This memorial honors the victims of lynchings through racial terrorism from slavery through Jim Crow. The memorial is a product of the research and hard work of the Equal Justice Initiative under the leadership of Bryan Stevenson, a Black lawyer who fights for people trapped in the prison system, a system that Michelle Alexander researched in depth in her 2010 transformational book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. Now, as a nation, as a community of storytellers, as shapers of the memory of the people, we have a historical, moral, and ethical responsibility to tell the horrors of lynching. But in order to do this well, we must allow Black people to lead that process. Black people have to be allowed to tell our own story because we hold the story differently in our bodies as the targets of this kind of terror. I'm sure most of you listening right now are probably finding some level of relief that you are not actively displaying images of lynching. And therefore, what I'm talking about does not necessarily apply directly to your context or your current exhibit. But I did not bring the subject matter today for you all as artists or exhibitors or partners in museums. I really brought it for myself. And I'm inviting you to wrestle with me the challenge ahead for the George Floyd Global Memorial, because whatever I and my community do with the stories we are charged to care for and uphold from the 2020 uprising, it will impact you. You see, it is common for people to come to the memorial and identify what they see as art. However, I have come to call everything creative expressions of pain and hope. Because art is what we buy, sell, trade, and exhibit. But these offerings are more than a transactional experience. These offerings are the product of the pain from Black death. They are a collective response to the trauma of a lynching designed to strike fear into the hearts of Black people. They protest the design to produce social order. They protest the design to silence us. All the stories that I and my community called to care for exist because George Floyd and others were lynched. That is a very heavy cross to bear. Now, as it was said earlier, I have a master's divinity degree in ethics. And I can tell you that there are all kinds of ethical dilemmas we face on a daily basis in relation to this memorial. But it is not that we face them, but how we face them that matters. I really like what Amy Soccaro has to say in her book, Exhibiting Atrocity, Memorial Museums and the Politics of Past Violence. I quote her: "There are three primary functions that memorial museums are created to fulfill. The first is what we can consider the museum function. That is their role as a mechanism of truth about history and preserving the past. In this sense, they aspire to be houses of history where the past is uncovered, documented, and preserved, and the truth about what happened is revealed to their visitors. The second is what we can consider the memorial function, which is to serve as a space of healing and repair. In this, they are a form of symbolic reparation that seeks to give acknowledgement to the victims and serve as a solemn space of mourning and remembrance in the effort to help heal and repair a community. The final function embodies what is most new and unique about these museums and is the very reason that this hybrid form has emerged. They are intended to morally educate visitors to internalize an ethic of never again," end quote. As a memorial site where Black people died to maintain social order, we have this moral and ethical obligation to tell the truth of what happened. We have discerned that the best way to do that is to uplift the voices of the people and preserve their offerings, which is an extension of their voice. We have an estimated over 3,000 offerings, and together they sing the chord of justice in a 10-part harmony. It has become abundantly clear to me that me and my team are not curators or storytellers. We're actually more so story keepers. And we must continue to let the people tell their own story. For who can tell it better than those who marched, who cried, who showed up, who felt the trauma of a lynching firsthand? It is our collective song for justice that will help us heal. I know it. I see it. I feel it. There is something about these objects that hold a kind of energy. It is as if we gave ourselves a gift of healing through our own pain, packaged it up and set it aside to be given back to us just at the right time. Our collective grief will both help us to remember and to heal. As we take the intentional time to look back, we will understand how to move forward. But we need to be mindful of how we look back and what we see when we look back and what we take with us as we move forward. It is this process that is key to getting us to that never again that Amy speaks about. Museums must understand that it is not the exhibition of Black death alone. It is not museums must understand that it is not the exhibition of Black death alone, that will help us heal our nation. The logic is not enough to move us towards compassion. It requires the story and the people who hold the story. So I'm going to do a little exercise. When I say 2 + 1 = 3, how does that make you feel? Do you feel anything? Just think about that for a moment. Okay, so now when I say 2 parents birthed 1 child and they became a family of 3 people, how does that make you feel? Anything different from that first statement? Okay, and finally, if I were to say it as Bob and Estella had their first child and named him Donald, the 3 of them became a family. What do you feel now? The logic of all 3 statements is the same. 2 + 1 = 3. But the story and the way in which the story is heard will change how we respond or engage that logic. While this is a gathering of many who are in the museum or art industry, um, I want to make sure that I acknowledge that the George Floyd Global Memorial is not a museum. Not in its DNA, no. We are the memorial that the people built. There are many existing museums who actually wanted to collect from the organic memorial that grew during the 2020 uprising, but they were held at bay as part of the protest. Because you see, in July 2018, 2 years after Philando Castile was lynched in Minnesota, the objects preserved by his family from his memorial and protest were sent to a local prominent museum, and an exhibit called Art and Healing in the Moment was curated. Now, while the family expressed words of appreciation, the popular opinion in the community was that the exhibit failed because it did not tell the truth of the story as the people would have told it. So even during the uprising of 2020, people remembered that and recalled what happened and would whisper to me, "Don't let them take it. We need to build our own museum." And what was really being said behind those whispers was this simple sentiment: we want to tell our own story. Who else is going to get it right but us? Now, again, my background is not in museum work. My background is in academic administration and in racial justice advocacy. And it is my professional opinion that the reason why the museum got the Philando Castile story wrong, it is because it is extremely difficult for institutions that have not dealt with the structural racism within its walls to champion stories of racial justice. The majority of museums in this country are deeply white, not just in leadership, but in heritage, culture, and operations. For these kinds of institutions to tell the stories of Black death in a way that will lead us to hope and healing is near impossible if they have not been doing the work to correct its institutionalized racism. At best, these institutions can posture themselves to play supporting roles as forms of recompense to become a more just institution. It is not enough to hire a single Black curator or contract a Black artist. We have to build in this country new institutions without the legacy of racial oppression, oppression designed by and for the people who hold and own the story in their bones. Then and only then, through collaboration, will we be able to exhibit more than the pain of the past, but also the hope for the future. As a country, it is not impossible to exhibit these stories of Black death or stories of lynching, but it has to come from the Black community. It has to be birthed out of our collective experience because we know how to make the lynching stop and thus bring hope. We know how to not lynch Black people better than anyone else in this country because we want to live. Therefore, fundamentally, how we tell our story will be different, even if we are navigating the same factual scenario. In conclusion, I need you to understand that the legacy of the white exhibition of Black Death is indeed one of trauma that is alive and well. And those exhibitions are not always in museums, but they are historically first played out in the living racism of this country. But all is not lost. If we come together and imagine this industry of storytelling and story keeping as a hub for our nation's racial healing, museums will be able to do more than just preserve our past and our present. We will also preserve our future. The question I have for those listening is not, will you let us tell our own story? Though the title may suggest that. But the reality is, in these past 20 months of building a new kind of institution, I've experienced the answer to that question to be consistently yes. The question I have is this: will you help us tell our own story? Do not let us fail. If we fail, this origin story might be lost. And if this origin story is lost, it will be harder to heal. You may not be the one who gets to tell the story, but I can guarantee you that you get to be the ones to listen to our stories and find your healing too. One of the things that I love about this space is the way in which, again, creative expressions of pain and hope, people would take cardboard and just put to the paper their imagination of what we need to do or where we're going and how we are getting there. And that's what we see on the left. On the right side, you see an enamel on steel, a Sankofa bird. A Sankofa bird is in the West African tradition that has been adopted by African American communities in the United States that simply mean this: its head is facing back, its feet are facing forward, that we have to look back in order to understand where we are going. So it embraces this concept of remembrance and rememory in order to figure out how to go forward, how to heal, how to do better, how to be better. And this piece was done by one of our art elders, Miss Esther, in the St. Paul community, in the Minneapolis and St. Paul community. You'll see at George Floyd Square the gathering of people. It's an intersection in the street. Really has become a space and a place for people to hold their grief, hold their pain, hold their protest. We've held several candlelight vigils in this space in the community. And on the right side, you see a segment of one of the altars that are in this place, the designated area where George Floyd took his last breath. We light it almost every single night with candles, between LED or real candles, depending on the wind factor. You'll see many iterations and versions and ideas around the Black Power Fist. And then on top of that, the ways in which people interact with that, the way in which people engage and find hope in the space. You'll see a greenhouse that the people built. Neighbors who had skill sets as contractors came together to say, how do we build a space that will help keep the offerings that are live plants alive through the winter months. And so the community built a greenhouse in the middle of the street. It is powered by electricity and heaters that keep it warm year round. And on one side where you see the life of the plants thriving in the middle of winter, on the other side, you also see what I refer to as burnt offerings, when someone actually committed arson to try to silence the story. But even then, I remember waking up that morning and I got all these phone calls because the fire happened around like maybe 5 o'clock in the morning. Um, and I walked into the space and people were wondering, well, what are we going to do? And the answer is, well, and we're going to tell this story too, because burnt offerings has a significant spiritual uh, um, place or language in so many religions around the world. And so just because the offerings were burned, it doesn't make them any less of an offering. It doesn't make them any less powerful. It doesn't erase their message. If anything, it enhances their message. There were, during the uprising, protest signs and notes and cards everywhere. Like they crawled up the walls and they're out into the street and all along the sidewalks, and people would gather and hold space and add more and add more and add more. And so our work in caretaking is to really care for every single offering that we can. If the elements don't get it, or if another human being doesn't come and get it, our commitment is to care for people's voice, to care for people's story, to care for people's protests, even down to the smallest items that are laid in the memorial. One thing that's always important for us that to let people know is that George Floyd Square has the names of hundreds and hundreds of people. It's not just a memorial to George Floyd. So the mourning passage is a list of 168 names of people across the country who have been killed due to police violence or lynched by police violence or white vigilantes. And being able to say their names, being able to hold that space, being able to remember who they are is extremely important. And we work year round as caretakers in the heat of summer or the cold of winter. How do we continue to tell the stories? How do we continue to upload or uphold, not upload, but uphold the hope of a better community, a better future, a better world in which we believe that we should live, where there's no more lynchings. So we like to say all day, every day, we're people over property, and that everything is somebody's offering. And that really is how we preserve and conserve these stories, is just making sure that nobody's story is considered unvaluable, and that nobody is not considered unvaluable. How do we ensure that people are not reduced to the level of property? So with that, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for peering a little bit into my story, into the story of my community, into this kind of imagination of what museums and exhibits can be when it comes to the relationship of Black death, and how do we hold that with sensitivity, and how do we actually tell these stories so that we can heal. So thank you.